Hi everybody, thank you Peter and Heather for the invitation, really glad to be here, and thanks everyone involved in helping put the event on and to everyone for coming. So as you'll know if you've signed up to this event, we're today talking about a project that we've been working on for the last few years on anti-racist scholar activism, also the topic of the book that we recently published. And to give a bit of background, the motivation for this book, born out of our frustrations as PhD students with an academia that we saw as being really disconnected from struggles for social and racial justice. And the book emerges from that context, but we also really try to pay attention to glimmers of hope, the inspiration that we can derive from those engaged in praxis that pushes against the norm, and those who find space to work with and for social justice movements despite the barriers of the university. So to give you a bit of an outline of the talk today, we'll say something about the research that the project's based on. We'll then give some working definitions of anti-racism, scholar activism, and talk a little bit about the university context, the context in which university-based scholar activism is situated. And then we'll move on to some of the key ideas from the book, the idea of working in service, the idea of reparative theft, struggle where you are, and then think briefly about some of the difficult questions that arise through anti-racist scholar activism.
Okay, so the research that we want to centre today then looks at the accounts of 29 people who either worked or studied as PhD researchers in British universities and were involved in anti-racist activism. I guess it's worth us saying that although we focus in this book on university-based scholar activism, of course, not all scholar activists are based within universities. The majority of the people we spoke to then, we interviewed, were people of colour, although there were some white people that we spoke to too. There was considerable variation in terms of career stage and in terms of the academic disciplines in which people worked, so from across the social sciences and humanities, and variation in terms of the kinds of anti-racist activism that those we interviewed were involved in. Our research had three sort of key concerns, the first being what anti-racist scholar activism means today. And here we were trying to push beyond some of the common sense understandings of anti-racist scholar activism to try and problematize and complicate the term. The second concern explored the sort of institutional context in which scholar activism is based. University-based scholar activism, and critique that context from the standpoint of anti-racist scholar activism. But it's the third concern there that's most relevant to what we want to talk about today. So key to what we're talking about today is the idea that despite the problematics of the neoliberal, imperial, institutionally racist university, there remain these pockets of possibility that Heather mentioned within our institutions for anti-racist scholar activism. And we can exploit those pockets of possibility to partially mitigate or offset or utilise the complicities that arise from affiliating with institutional power for the benefit of anti-racism. Before we think about those possibilities, I think a bit of context is useful. So firstly, what do we mean when we talk of anti-racism and scholar activism? Well, as lots of you will know, anti-racist resistance in Britain has a vast and complex history. And that's why Alana Lentin suggests that it's impossible to speak of anti-racism as a unitary or unproblematic phenomenon. Although we want to avoid simplistic definitions of anti-racism as the inverse of racism, it's no doubt the case that a key tension in British anti-racism relates to how racism is defined and understood. And after all, we can only delegitimate racism if we can accurately pinpoint it. So whilst mainstream understandings see racism often as being a problem of individual attitudes, more critical understandings recognise that racism is deeply embedded in our institutions and the very fabric of our society. It's systemic and it's historically rooted. And it's these more critical understandings that we suggest define anti-racist scholar activism. Understandings that also emphasise that racism intersects with other structures of power. And we use the term scholar activism to point to the dual role that's occupied by academics who attempt to combine their scholarship and their activism in pursuit of social justice. In some respects then, scholar activism describes an approach that is vastly different to, perhaps even antithetical to, traditional approaches in academia. But in other ways, some of the specific praxes or elements of scholar activism might overlap with some other approaches within academia. And so we're constantly treading this fine line then between employing a definition of scholar activism that is so narrow as to only, so narrow that it draws only on idealized versions of activism, and one that's so broad that it overinflates the concept. And when we do that, we empty it of its definitional power. So we're kind of always treading that fine line. I don't want to say too much about this here, but I think it is important that we say something about the context in which university-based anti-racist scholar activism is situated. And despite their sort of outward projection as spaces of enlightenment, universities have not, and they've never been, open or equal or levelling. They're key apparatus in the maintenance of a deeply unequal order. And this is why we talk of the university as the neoliberal, imperial, institutionally racist university. So to say that the university is neoliberal is to recognise that rather than existing for the public good, universities have been repositioned as a commodity. Students have become customers, their education a service that they purchase, and universities and the academics that work within them, the service providers. And this consumer-producer dynamic is reified further still when we think about the omnipresence of kind of performance indicators that are often linked to sort of so-called customer satisfaction. The imperial university then captures the way in which universities are located within, as Darren Webb puts it, a network of state apparatuses of control, discipline, surveillance, carcerality, and violence. So to understand the university as imperial is to reject the myth of exceptionalism, which sees a university as sitting above society's unequal power structures. And instead it's to recognise that the university actively reproduces those power relations, particularly as it manifests along racial and colonial lines. And the institutionally racist university captures the ways in which racism is embedded and reproduced within our universities, how it permeates hiring practices, how it shapes the awarding gap for students, as well as kind of racialized securitization and surveillance on our campuses. And we use the hyphenation in describing the neoliberal, imperial, institutionally racist university to point to the ways in which these things operate simultaneously and how they interconnect with one another. And so this is the context in which university-based scholar activism takes place. And while we, in the book, try to offer a strong critique of this concept, it is worth noting, as Lapapperson does, that the university isn't a monolith. It's a site of competing and contradictory forces. And therefore, it can offer us opportunities to exploit those contradictions for the benefit of anti-racism. And so I'll pass back over to Remi so we can start to think about some of those contradictions and possibilities.
So one of the ideas we unpack in the book and which we suggest is a foundational tenet of anti-racist scholar activism, a foundational idea in our own thinking, is the notion of working in service. And this is an idea we take primarily from the work of Ambalavana Sivanandan, the late Sri Lankan activist and writer, who, as many of you will know, has been one of the leading anti-racist thinkers and activists in Britain and beyond. And reflecting on his takeover and directorship of the Institute of Race Relations, through which the Institute was radically reorientated, he said this: there was a plethora of grassroots community movements at the time that we could serve. If we could not be at the barricades in the fight for racial justice, we could at least be servitors in that cause. We could do research that spoke to the issues and problems confronting Black communities. We could be a servicing station. We could put gas in the tanks of Black and third world peoples on their way to liberation. A few of those that we spoke to directly referred to Sivanandan's idea of service. This was a key influence on their praxis. Even those who didn't trace the ideas directly to Sivanandan conveyed agreement with the broad sentiment that we should be working to serve those who Sivanandan calls communities of resistance. And similarly to Sivanandan, the Black feminist scholar Patricia Hill Collins talks about working in service to social justice. For Collins, this praxis is oppositional to the hegemonic pressures to work in service to power or the status quo. From this, we can argue that scholar activism is counter-hegemonic. So to look at this through the accounts of our participants, we can see this notion quite clearly in the account of Oliver here, who says, I'm an academic and scholar, but actually I'm a public intellectual, which means I'm owned by the community and there to service the community. I'm a public intellectual who happens to have access to a range of resources through the academy. So in this, there's a clear sense of counter-hegemony. He troubles and pushes against the assumption that we work primarily for the university. Instead, he works for and is owned by the community. So to think about what working in service offers as a principle, we suggest that it offers a corrective to traditional approaches to academia. It reminds us whose side we're on, not the side of power. It also reminds us why we do the work we do, and in so doing encourages us to guard against being driven by individual gain, career progression, or merely to extract. Instead, it encourages us to hold on to a commitment to pursuing anti-racist social justice. And in addition to this, it prompts us to push against power dynamics that can arise in social movements that unduly elevate academics or the supposed knowledge of academics. So just a caveat before looking at this in more detail. It's very easy to romanticize social movements from the academy, but it's important that we remain critical. And this is what Alison speaks to here. She says, we need to question this assumption that your politics and your ideas align so neatly with a social movement, and therefore you would work unquestionably in service. With this in mind, we'd argue that it's useful to think of our service as ultimately being to anti-racism, and here those understandings, those more critical understandings of racism become important again. Of course, as we work in service to anti-racism, in that process we will work with and critically in service to communities of resistance. So to make this a bit more tangible, we want to highlight 3 key ways that working in service manifests in practice. First, we have accountability. So we might ask, are we accountable, and to whom are we accountable? To work in service is to be accountable to communities of resistance and to the broader anti-racist project. For many of those that we spoke to, accountability involves embeddedness in communities of resistance, and Maria spoke to this. She said, this work takes time in a community and it takes relationships. And the relationships, I think, are the most fundamental part. And for me to do it ethically, it involves me having personal relationships with people that are regular relationships where there's accountability. And it's always my central goal. So she highlights here the importance of showing up, building meaningful relationships, and investing time in the communities that we work in and for. It's important to say that this work swims against the tide of the neoliberal university, where time's squeezed and time used in such a way is not rewarded or recognised, and is even discouraged and disincentivized. And direct accountability, like Maria describes, is important, but we'd also argue that this accountability has to be imagined as well to a certain extent, which is to say, it's not always practical or ethical for us to constantly check in with communities on everything that we do. Moreover, we might often be working on issues that are so vast that we can never hope to be in contact with all of those affected. The second point here relates to usefulness. We might ask, is our work useful? Who is our work useful to? Our work should be, whether directly or indirectly, useful to communities of resistance and anti-racism. And Sajid speaks to this. He says, your research agenda is often derived from your involvement in community or grassroots organisations and campaigns and movements. To me, that's where good research comes from. For me, it's about how socially useful is your research? How socially useful is your academic work? Again, like accountability, Sajid conveys a sense that usefulness can be better determined through involvement with communities of resistance. Thirdly, we have questions of accessibility and reach, which is to ask, is our work accessible to the communities we claim to be working with and for? On this, Thomas spoke about the need to do work in a range of formats for a range of audiences, delivering sessions in schools and community centres, as well as writing in typical academic forums. And what's key for us here is that Thomas isn't talking about completely rejecting any writing in academic forms. Like others, he recognised the importance of writing for different audiences. So despite the stereotypes that portray scholar activists as anti-intellectual, many of those that we spoke to really valued academic rigour, intellectualism, and held very high standards. So the point is that there has to be some effort towards meaningful engagement with communities of resistance, and this is what Thomas encapsulates. So with working in service as a foundation to scholar activist praxis, we now want to think about what we refer to as reparative theft.
Yeah, so the idea of theft or stealing from the university is one that we take from Harney and Moten, from their work on the Undercommons. And they said, one can only sneak into the university and steal what one can, abuse its hospitality, spite its mission, join its refugee colony, its gypsy encampment, be in but not of. This is the path of the subversive intellectual in the modern university. The subversive intellectual came under false pretenses with bad documents out of love. Her labour is as necessary as it is unwelcome. And this understanding is based on a critique of the university, an understanding that the university is underpinned by white supremacy and colonialism, and that the university actively reproduces racialized capitalism and its structural inequalities. And from this understanding comes an imperative for us to push against the university, to steal what we can, to subvert it, to be in but not of it. And this ties nicely, we think, with the idea of working in service. Both reflect a kind of counter-hegemonic orientation. We are in but not of the university because we are of and with communities of resistance. We're in the university to serve those communities, and we can do this by stealing. Like the idea of being in service, the idea of theft was articulated explicitly by some interviewees who were familiar with and inspired by Harney and Moten. And it was articulated more implicitly by others too. So let's just take a look at one example. So here Galiev says it's a form of redistribution. I think that what we've got to remember is that the university has a massive accumulation of not just economic capital, but social capital. That social and economic capital is not entirely self-generated. That comes off being able to exploit the social and economic capital of people that work within, but also outside of the university. And people within the university that may not necessarily be academics. I think because of that, the people outside of the university are fully entitled to use the resources that the university often excludes them from. It's a form of redistributive justice in that we've got to recognise the exploitation that the university engages in. Oh, sorry. I'm just trying to move your faces. There we go. There's a clear understanding here that the university is built on ill-gotten gains and that it continues today to exploit. The university's wealth and power isn't self-generated. And in this sense, the theft can be thought of as a form of redistribution or even reparation. And this is a really important point because it shows that the theft theft from the university to benefit or in service to the communities of resistance that we're involved in can be itself an act of racial justice. In other words, that it's morally justifiable. But the emphasis on theft continues to make clear that this work is subversive, that it pushes against the university from within the university, and that this work often requires a level of duplicity or fugitivity. So in practice, this theft might most immediately manifest in terms of funding. So as Sajid is getting at here, it's possible for us as academics to find ways of writing community groups and the activist organisations that we're involved in, to writing them into bids. And here, impact funding or social responsibility, public engagement funding streams might be particularly useful. And of course, we might have to be quite creative in our framing in order to access them. There's also time. So can we sneak time out of our working day to do activist work? How can we set up our academic work in ways that better enable us to do this? Could we develop PhD projects to leverage time and labour for communities of resistance? Some of our interviewees spoke to some of the kind of very small acts that we can do, for example, around using university resources to print leaflets or other resources for activist groups. And others still spoke of booking free meeting spaces in universities for activists and community groups who often struggle to find affordable space in city centres that have become heavily gentrified and in some cases colonised by our universities. And there's also the social and symbolic capital that can be stolen. So this is what Trevor is getting at here. He says to be a doctor affords you a privilege and perspective which opens those doors. It's exploiting or working in the margins of, I would say, the privilege that is afforded from being in a university. So we can repurpose forms of capital that are imbued upon us as academics in support of anti-racism. I think an important caveat here is that although there are these pockets of possibility in the university that can be leveraged, resources that can be stolen, we recognise that there are significant barriers often to this work. So I'm thinking here about time pressures, workload inflation, performance management mechanisms, surveillance, the backlash that anti-racist scholar activists often face within their institutions, to name but a few. And it's really important that we recognise those barriers so that we don't romanticise the possibilities.
So the next idea we wanted to look at is this idea of struggle where you are. And we take this idea, as Heather said earlier, primarily from the late public intellectual and cultural theorist Stuart Hall. And he offered this as a brief comment, a note of advice to a Black community group who were grappling with considerations of how best to engage in anti-racism. A similar sentiment was expressed by the anti-colonial thinker and activist Walter Rodney, who argued that the first level of struggle for the intellectual is in their own sphere of operation, to take from it and transform it over time. And for us, this idea is generative in at least 4 different ways. Firstly, it reflects a degree of pragmatism with regards to what is achievable. As Hall himself explained, you can't do everything. You fight the battles that you can fight. For those involved in activist movements, such wisdom will surely seem familiar. It's a necessary realization in every activist journey that one cannot do it all. Secondly, and relatedly, we also read Struggle Where You Are to point to a movement that's far bigger than the individual. It encourages us to guard against individualism and intellectual vanguardism. Thirdly, we also understand Struggle Where You Are to have a particular inflection for those of us working in powerful institutions like the university. Nodding back to reparative theft, it implores us to repurpose the powerful machinery of the university to fuel the motors of resistance. And fourthly, calls to Struggle Where You Are demand a degree of introspection, a notion of particular significance given our focus on the anti-racist scholar activism that takes place in universities, and the mythical construction of the university as a liberal space detached from the racisms that structure society. So what does or what can struggling where we are in the university look like? This took on different forms for the people we spoke to, and some focused far more energy on struggling in the university than others. Regardless, there was a clear sense that the classroom or teaching was if not the key site for struggling where we are. As Darren Webb puts it, the classroom can offer a breathing space within the university, despite itself. And it's worth noting that teaching takes place in a context where the neoliberal university disincentivizes and devalues teaching, with research being valorized at the expense of teaching. Anti-racist scholar activist approaches to teaching then are fundamentally influenced by traditions of critical pedagogy, rejecting neutrality, encouraging critical thought, empowering students, transforming our classrooms, promoting democratization, and challenging the status quo inside and outside the classroom. Noting that critical pedagogy emerges from a historically class-based framework and has at times elided considerations of race, a number of our participants insisted on the importance of bringing an anti-racist approach to bear on critical pedagogy. And many scholars have done this before. Our contention is simply that there can be no critical pedagogy without an attentiveness to race. A key concept that we introduce in the book is the idea of a classroom to activism pipeline. And we use this pipeline metaphor to consider how we create the conditions for students to become involved in anti-racist activism. So we suggest the cultivation of critical thought is part of this pipeline, as is the transformation of our classrooms. But we also suggest that more is needed for the pipeline to function. And we've both taught classes that we'd hoped were really mobilizing, but which we later reflected had only led students to write more critical essays. They'd not been encouraged to act outside of their immediate context, which is the university and its often very limited modes of assessment. And in instances like these, we would suggest that the pipeline is blocked or leaky. In terms of what else is needed, those we spoke to emphasised the importance of building and embedding links with community groups and people affected by injustice. A particularly tangible example came from a legal scholar who told us about a law course that trains students to investigate cases of people who claim to have been wrongly convicted. Aaliyah spoke to this issue more generally, and she said, I suppose getting students to engage with local community projects and building relationships between the university and the community projects. I think that's really important because universities take a lot from community groups, don't they? So it's about what can we give back. So I suppose the module that I'm teaching on, that I'm working on, is a way of building relationships. So clearly, again, there's this recognition of the ills of the university and an imperative from that recognition to address the harms through our classroom by linking with community groups. There's some really big considerations here with regards to how we set up those relationships, how we avoid them becoming extractive, burdensome, or unproductive from the perspective of community groups. And just to touch briefly on this idea of struggling where you are outside of the classroom context. Several participants spoke about the importance of speaking up in staff meetings and elsewhere, and holding the university to account. As Galiev puts it, we should always pull them up on everything that they're doing, which is perpetuating inequality. If they're investing in the arms trade, if they're investing in Israeli military companies, if they're investing in fossil fuels, all that kind of stuff. Our job is to mitigate or ameliorate the fundamental, the systemic, the inequalities that the university engages in, and to always hold them to account. Others pointed out that it's in meetings where workloads and inequalities in the workplace get discussed, as well as student experiences and awarding gaps. And these spaces, although they're often incredibly limited, are where we can offer or present a critical voice. And one caveat on this, an important caveat, is to acknowledge that we're not all situated equally in this work. Some are more vulnerable than others, particularly those on precarious contracts and those from minoritized groups. And this means that it might not always be possible or strategically wise to challenge. Perhaps more productively, it might mean that scholar activists should raise issues collectively or think strategically about who's best able to speak in certain situations. Additionally, a number of those we spoke to also highlighted the importance of being involved in the union and participating in industrial action. This is an important point, given we're likely to be out on strike again soon. As Sajid puts it, for me, being on strike is one of the few ways in which a person is almost stripped naked and all you can see are their politics. For me, that is a moment where somebody's politics are laid bare. It's much more disappointing when somebody crosses a picket who claims to have progressive values and claims to have progressive credentials. So the picket line is a site for us to walk the walk, to struggle where we are as part of a collective for better working conditions. And there are two challenges to highlight here. Firstly, how do we make sure the union is as sharp as possible in centering the needs of those at the margins who face particular challenges, migrant academics, for example? Secondly, how do we connect such campus-based struggles to wider struggles for workers' rights and struggles against capitalism and exploitation?
Throughout the book then, we suggest that reflexivity is central to anti-racist scholar activist praxis. So this reflexivity enables us to reflect on the extent to which we're fulfilling our commitment to work in service to communities of resistance and our commitment to other elements of anti-racist scholar activism. And it also encourages us to reflect on the vested self-interest that we each might hold. And this in turn involves us reflecting on and refining our strategies, not as individuals, but as collectives. And this, we would suggest something that's really important here is making sure that we don't engage in what Sarah Ahmed calls a politics of declaration. So where there's simple admission of bad practice or privilege is mistaken as the end point. And instead, we need to see this process of continual action and reflection as something that's always unfinished. Given our affiliation with institutional power then, the principle of being reflexive also encourages us to grapple with some of the inevitable complicities and contradictions that arise through our work. So there's no escape from complicity under capitalism, and there's certainly no escape from complicity within the neoliberal, imperial, institutional racist academy. So the multifarious trappings of academia and its sort of deep implication in reproducing unequal power structures mean that it's important that we always ask ourselves, are we doing more harm than good? And this is an uncomfortable question that we really should be returning to and talking about time and time again. Central to being reflexive then is the praxis of questioning ourselves and also the power structures that we're propping up, that we're maintaining. And again, with that in mind, we need to be thinking about whether we're being co-opted by the system. And to reflect seriously on that question requires that we think about our relative positions of power, be they attributable to race or gender or class, disability, sexuality, any other stratifier. So this reflexive positionality has to be at the heart of anti-racist scholar activism. And when it is, it urges us to always consider our role in the academy, to never become too comfortable, and to be attentive to the possibility that we might actually be more effective from elsewhere. In other words, we might at some point in the future need to enact a politics of refusal and leave the university. So just to briefly sum up, HE is clearly fraught with problems, and many of these problems are deep-rooted and not easily resolved. It's neoliberal, imperial, institutionally racist, and the scholar activists that we spoke to grappled with the role that they play in propping up those oppressive systems, as well as grappling with being on the receiving end of the backlash that is often exerted upon them as a result of their counter-hegemonic praxis. Oops. Despite all of this, we argue that the university presents a range of opportunities, these pockets of possibility that we keep coming back to those of us who are committed to anti-racism. And with such enduring racial inequalities nationally and globally, such enduring injustices nationally and globally, it's vital that those of us who are committed to anti-racist resistance find ways of exploiting our positions and the spaces that the academy presents to us, all the while struggling where we are to reshape or perhaps radically overhaul the university in our collective vision. And we also should find ways of bolstering existing and building new alternatives to the university. So thank you so much for listening. I hope some of this resonates with some of the work that you're all engaged in. And yeah, I'll hand back over to you, Heather and Peter. Thank you.